officer.
License and registration, now.
Okay.
Hey! Don't move!
Oh, please.
Out of the car! Wait! Hands behind your back!
Please, I serve my country. I'm a veteran. Why are you
Unit
doing
23, subject in custody. Stay down.
What you're about to hear is a story that shocked an entire nation. It's the story of a 70-year-old woman named Dorothy Matthews, a decorated military veteran who served her country with pride for over 25 years. It's the story of how a routine traffic stop became a nightmare that would spark outrage across America and ignite a movement for police accountability. Before we get started, where are you tuning in from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And hey, if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, now's the time, because what's about to happen next will leave you speechless, and you won't want to miss stories like this. Dorothy Matthews was born in 1953 in Birmingham, Alabama. She joined the United States Army in 1978, during a time when being a black woman in the military came with its own set of challenges and barriers. But Dorothy didn't let that stop her. She served with distinction, earning multiple commendations for her service and dedication. After leaving the Army in 2003, she settled in Atlanta, Georgia, where she built a quiet, respectable life. She became a grandmother, volunteered at her local church, and was known throughout her neighborhood as a kind and dignified woman. Everyone who knew Dorothy had nothing but respect for her. On March 15, 2023, Dorothy was driving home from her doctor's appointment. The afternoon was warm and sunny. She had no idea that the next 20 minutes would change her life forever and become a catalyst for national change. Officer James Mitchell, a 6-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, spotted Dorothy's silver Honda Civic. According to his report, he pulled her over for an expired registration tag. But what happened next would contradict everything in that official report. The Bodycam footage shows Dorothy calmly pulling over. She rolls down her window, and her hands are visible on the steering wheel. She's nervous, like most people do during a traffic stop, but she's cooperative and respectful. You can hear her voice on the tape. "Good afternoon, officer. What seems to be the problem?" Officer Mitchell approaches the vehicle, and immediately his tone is different. It's aggressive, hostile, and disrespectful. He doesn't greet her kindly. He doesn't explain why he's pulled her over. Instead, he demands her license and registration in a voice that's sharp and commanding, as if she's already done something wrong. Dorothy, trying to comply, reaches toward her glove compartment. This is a normal action during any traffic stop. But Mitchell suddenly shouts, "Keep your hands where I can see them. Do not move." His voice is so forceful that Dorothy freezes, confused and frightened. She says, "Officer, I'm just getting my registration. You asked for it." But Mitchell doesn't hear an elderly woman trying to help. Instead, he opens her car door without permission. He grabs her arm and begins pulling her out of the vehicle. Dorothy is shocked. She hasn't done anything wrong. She hasn't resisted. She hasn't been disrespectful. Yet she's being physically removed from her own car by a man with a gun and a badge. As Mitchell pulls her out, Dorothy loses her balance. Her arthritic knees, weakened by age and decades of physical demands from her military service, give way. She falls toward the pavement. But instead of catching her, instead of showing any concern for an elderly woman who's clearly struggling, Mitchell uses her fall against her. He slams her body against the side of her car, then forces her to the ground. The Bodycam captures everything. You can see Dorothy's face contort in pain. You can hear her crying out, "Please, officer, please, you're hurting me. I haven't done anything." But Mitchell doesn't stop. He twists her arm behind her back with force that seems completely unnecessary. Dorothy is now lying on the hot pavement in March heat, her body being held down by a man who has not explained why any of this is happening. Other officers arrive on the scene, and instead of questioning what they're seeing, they help restrain her. They handcuff her while she's on the ground, still crying, still confused, still in pain. The entire interaction lasts less than 15 minutes, but by the end, Dorothy has visible injuries. Her arm is bruised where it was twisted. Her back is scraped from being thrown against the car and dragged across rough pavement. Her face shows the shock and trauma of what just happened. The charges filed against her were resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. But the body cam footage told a completely different story. It showed a woman who never resisted, who never posed any threat, and who was brutalized by someone entrusted with authority. In the days following the incident, Dorothy sought medical treatment. The physical injuries, the bruises, the scrapes, the sprained wrist, would heal. But the psychological wounds ran much deeper. Dorothy, who had worn the uniform of the United States Army with pride, was now terrified of police officers. She had nightmares. She was afraid to leave her house. The woman who had been strong enough to serve her country was broken by what one officer had done to her in 15 minutes. Her family encouraged her to come forward. They hired a lawyer. They filed complaints with the police department's Internal Affairs Division. But weeks went by with no action, no investigation, no consequences for Officer Mitchell. He continued his job. He continued wearing his badge. He continued responding to calls in the community while Dorothy struggled with the trauma of what he had done. Then, on April 28, 2023, someone leaked the body cam footage online. Perhaps it was a fellow officer who believed the truth needed to be told. Perhaps it was someone within the department who was disgusted by what they saw. Whatever the reason, the video appeared on social media and within hours it had been viewed millions of times. The hashtag #JusticeForDorothy began trending on Twitter within minutes. News outlets picked up the story. Civil rights organizations demanded action. People across the country watched the footage in disbelief. How could this happen to a 70-year-old woman? How could this happen to a veteran? How could an officer use this much force against someone who posed absolutely no threat? The comments poured in. This is disgusting. She served our country and this is how we treat her? This is exactly why people don't trust the police. That officer needs to be fired and prosecuted. Celebrities spoke out. Activists organized protests outside police headquarters. The story dominated the news cycle for weeks. Dorothy, emboldened by the public support, did interview after interview. She spoke about her military service, about the pride she felt wearing the uniform, about how shocked and betrayed she felt by what happened. In one particularly emotional interview on a major news network, she said, "I gave my life to this country. I stood up for freedom and democracy, and my own country treated me like I was a criminal, like I was dangerous. I was just a scared 70-year-old woman, and that officer treated me like an enemy. I still don't understand why." The pressure on the Atlanta Police Department became impossible to ignore. The department launched an internal investigation into Officer Mitchell's conduct. As they dug deeper, they discovered this wasn't an isolated incident. There were other complaints. There were other citizens who had reported excessive force. There was a pattern of behavior that suggested Mitchell had a problem with authority and an inability to de-escalate situations. 3 months after the body cam footage went public, Officer James Mitchell was terminated. The police chief issued a formal apology to Dorothy Matthews. The city of Atlanta settled a lawsuit with her for $1.2 million. More importantly, the case sparked a broader conversation about police training, about bias in law enforcement, and about the need for better oversight and accountability. Dorothy's case became a turning point. Civil rights organizations cited it as a prime example of why police reform isn't just an abstract political issue. It's about real people, real lives, real dignity. The incident led to new training protocols in Atlanta, new de-escalation requirements, and a renewed commitment to holding officers accountable for their actions. But perhaps the most important impact was the message Dorothy's story sent, that speaking up matters, that truth matters, and that one person's courage can spark a movement for change. Dorothy Matthews, a 70-year-old black woman and military veteran, became a symbol of resilience and justice. She had already served her country once. Now she was serving it again by demanding accountability and fighting for a better system.
Their age or their background deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And it reminds us that change is possible when we refuse to stay silent. But the story didn't end with Mitchell's termination. In fact, What happened next was equally important and equally powerful. Dorothy decided to use her platform and her settlement money to create the Dorothy Matthews Foundation for Police Accountability. She wanted to make sure that her suffering would lead to tangible change, not just in Atlanta, but across the country. The foundation focused on three main areas. First, it provided legal support to victims of police brutality who couldn't afford lawyers. Second, it funded research into police training and de-escalation techniques to prevent incidents like hers from happening to others. And third, it advocated for policy changes at both the local and national level to increase police accountability and transparency. Within the first year, the foundation had helped over 50 victims of police brutality access legal representation. Some of those cases resulted in significant settlements. Others resulted in officers being held accountable. Dorothy became a fierce advocate, testifying before city councils and state legislatures about the need for police reform. Officer Mitchell didn't disappear quietly. After being fired from the Atlanta Police Department, he attempted to get hired in another jurisdiction. But now his name was known. His actions were documented and viral. No major police department wanted the controversy of hiring him. He eventually took a job in private security, far away from the power and authority he once wielded. But there were other officers like Mitchell out there. Officers with the same biases, the same hair-triggered tempers, the same lack of training in de-escalation. Dorothy knew that one fired officer wasn't enough. The system itself needed to change. Her advocacy work led to several important developments. The city of Atlanta implemented mandatory implicit bias training for all officers. They adopted a new use of force policy that emphasized de-escalation and the protection of vulnerable populations, particularly the elderly and those with disabilities. They increased the number of body cams and implemented stricter protocols for when footage could be released to the public. They created a civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. Other cities took notice. Dorothy was invited to speak at police departments across the country. She shared her story with officers, with city officials, with community leaders. Some listened, some didn't. But the conversation had changed. Dorothy had made sure of that. 2 years after the incident, Dorothy was invited to the White House. The president wanted to meet her, to hear her story directly. It was a moment of vindication, a recognition that her suffering had led to something meaningful. When Dorothy walked into that room, she thought about the scared, confused woman on the pavement in March of 2023. She thought about how far she'd come. The president told her, "Your courage has changed the conversation about police accountability in this country. You didn't have to speak out. You could have taken your settlement and disappeared. But you chose to fight for change. That takes real strength." Dorothy replied, "I served my country for 25 years in uniform. I believed in what this country stood for. When I was treated the way I was, it broke my heart. But it also made me determined. If my pain can prevent someone else from going through what I went through, then it means something. Then it was worth it." Back in Atlanta, Dorothy continued her daily life, but she was a changed person in many ways. She was still traumatized by what happened. She still had moments when she saw a police car and felt her heart race. She still suffered from nightmares. The physical and psychological scars didn't completely disappear, but she had transformed her trauma into purpose. Her grandchildren were proud of her. Her church community rallied around her. Her neighbors, who had always respected her, now saw her as a civil rights leader. Dorothy had become the face of police accountability, not because she wanted to be, but because she felt obligated to use her voice for those who didn't have one. Years later, when people asked Dorothy about the incident, she would sometimes cry. The memories were still raw, but she would also talk about the changes that had come as a result. She would talk about the victims she'd helped through her foundation. She would talk about the officers who had received better training because of her advocacy. She would talk about the policies that had changed because of her willingness to speak out. One of the most powerful moments came when a young officer, trained under the new protocols that were implemented in part because of Dorothy's case, stopped a 75-year-old man for a broken taillight. Instead of being aggressive and escalating the situation, the officer used de-escalation techniques. He was respectful and professional. He explained everything he was doing. He treated the elderly man with dignity. When the officer later heard that his approach had been influenced by policies inspired by Dorothy Matthews, he reached out to her and thanked her. He told her that her fight for accountability had made him a better officer. Dorothy received that message and wept. This was why she had spoken out. This was why she had continued to fight even when it was painful and difficult. Because her struggle had the power to change not just laws and policies, but people's hearts and minds. Dorothy's story became part of the broader conversation about race, policing, and justice. She thought about the scared, confused woman on the pavement in March of 2023. She thought about how far she'd come. The president told her, "Your courage has changed the conversation about police accountability in this country. You didn't have to speak out. You could have taken your settlement and disappeared. But you chose to fight for change. That takes real strength." Dorothy replied, "I served my country for 25 years in uniform. I believed in what this country stood for. When I was treated the way I was, it broke my heart. But it also made me determined. If my pain can prevent someone else from going through what I went through, then it means something. Then it was worth it." Back in Atlanta, Dorothy continued her daily life, but she was a changed person in many ways. She was still traumatized by what happened. She still had moments when she saw a police car and felt her heart race. She still suffered from nightmares. The physical and psychological scars didn't completely disappear, but she had transformed her trauma into purpose. Her grandchildren were proud of her. Her church community rallied around her. Her neighbors, who had always respected her, now saw her as a civil rights leader. Dorothy had become the face of police accountability, not because she wanted to be, but because she felt obligated to use her voice for those who didn't have one. Years later, when people asked Dorothy about the incident, she would sometimes cry. The memories were still raw, but she would also talk about the changes that had come as a result. She would talk about the victims she'd helped through her foundation. She would talk about the officers who had received better training because of her advocacy. She would talk about the policies that had changed because of her willingness to speak out. One of the most powerful moments came when a young officer, trained under the new protocols that were implemented in part because of Dorothy's case, stopped a 75-year-old man for a broken taillight. Instead of being aggressive and escalating the situation, the officer used de-escalation techniques. He was respectful and professional. He explained everything he was doing. He treated the elderly man with dignity. When the officer later heard that his approach had been influenced by policies inspired by Dorothy Matthews, he reached out to her and thanked her. He told her that her fight for accountability had made him a better officer. Dorothy received that message and wept. This was why she had spoken out. This was why she had continued to fight even when it was painful and difficult. Because her struggle had the power to change not just laws and policies, but people's hearts and minds. Dorothy's story became part of the broader conversation about race, policing, and justice in America. Universities included her case in their criminal justice courses. Civil rights organizations used her footage in their training materials. She was invited to speak at conferences and seminars. She appeared on podcasts and documentaries. Her story reached millions of people and inspired them to think differently about police accountability. But Dorothy never forgot where it started. She never forgot that moment on March 15, 2023, when Officer James Mitchell made a choice that would change everything. A choice to escalate instead of de-escalate. a choice to use force against a woman who posed no threat, a choice that ultimately cost him his career and his reputation. That one choice, that one moment of brutality captured on a body cam, became the catalyst for change. It showed the world that accountability matters. It showed that speaking out can make a difference. It showed that one person, one story, one moment of courage can spark a movement. Dorothy Matthews, the 70-year-old black veteran woman, had served her country twice, once in uniform, defending freedom and democracy, and once more as a civilian, fighting for justice and accountability. Her legacy wasn't just the policies that changed or the officers who were held accountable. Her legacy was the message she sent to every victim of injustice, every person who had suffered in silence. Your story matters. Your pain matters. Your voice matters. And sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to speak the truth, to let the world see what really happened, to refuse to let injustice go unnoticed. That person was Dorothy Matthews, and her name will be remembered as someone who fought for change when it mattered most. Subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos.